work session, I should say, on January 14, 2025. It's 3:02. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'm going to start with Mr. Stokel. You give our invocation.
All right, if you'll join me. Our Heavenly Father, we come here today to understand the city better, each other better, and make decisions for the betterment of Odessa. Please help us understand our roles and to make the best decisions that we can. Please extend grace and patience to the staff and the citizens. I had asked this morning for lots of grace for the staff. They have been troopers and hung in there with us, especially our friends down in billing and collections. So pray for patience and understanding as we get everything sorted out. Pray for your guidance through our decisions and ask for your wisdom in the decisions we're going to make. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Craig. We'll begin with number 3 item, the presentation from City Financial Advisor and Bond Counsel, presentation regarding debt position and mechanisms. Katie.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council.
Afternoon.
Good to see you all today. Happy Tuesday. So we have some very special guests with us today. We're excited to have them present in front of you. Some of you may know them, especially if you were on council before or, just being around the city. So George and Glenn are here today. George Williford is with Hilltop Securities. They are our financial advisor, and they have been advising the city on our financial matters, debt issuance, anytime we deal with rating agencies, things like that. And they've been doing that since 1997, 96. So they know us very well. George has been working with us a long time, so he's going to come and present for you the mechanisms that municipalities have available to them for financing. And then in addition to George, we have Glenn Opal, who's with us today, and he is from our bond council. And so anytime we have debt issuance, we work very closely with both of these gentlemen. So I won't take up any more time, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Mr. George.
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all. Yes,
Mayor, members of the council, for the record, George Williford of Hilltop Securities, and it's a pleasure to be back. And as Kaylee said, I think most everyone is new, at least since last debt issuance, except for Councilman Thompson, who has been around, and then, of course, in the past had the pleasure of working with Richard as well. And since the city really hadn't been active, and knowing that there had been a lot of kind of discussion about what cities can do, and so on with respect to undertaking financing of projects and so on, we tried to put together some information for you. And I'm going to go through this first book that you have and what I have on the board fairly quickly. For each of these items, there is a specific page, an individual page behind this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to walk kind of through this chart. Cities have the ability to issue general obligation bonds and certificates of obligation, and I kind of pair those together because general obligation bonds, of course, do require that they be approved by voters at an election. Certificates of obligation do not. However, certificates of obligation require that a notice of intent to issue those be published starting at least 45 days before the date that issuance or authorization would occur. Has to be published for 2 consecutive weeks in a newspaper and then also on the city's website. And during that period preceding authorization, there is the opportunity for the public to generate a petition if there's question about doing certificates and so on. Otherwise, they're a very appropriate type of debt issuance for the projects that that they're intended to do. And I just got an email today that kind of misstated from another city. One of their citizens said, well, they were only originally created to address emergency situations, and no, that's not the case. But the legislature did clarify, and I'll show you in a minute, that with respect to public improvements and so on, COs still, and the conditions that you can issue them. The reason, again, that I pair those kind of together is they're the same credit. The attorney that wrote the CO Act, I've heard him say that one time in a setting even so, and the rating agencies and everyone view it that way. So once issued, a certificate of obligation is a general obligation issue of the city and so on. And because of that, both of those will offer the lowest interest rate because it's a kind of full faith and credit, full ad valorem tax pledge securing that. Now, that doesn't mean that taxes have to be used for the repayment, and even the legislature recognized this when they passed House Bill 1869. I'll show you some, because if a CO is issued, like in 2021, the city's issue for the water treatment plant, that is fully self-supported, the repayment by water and sewer revenues on an annual basis. And so there is no tax rate set for repayment. Yes, the taxes do secure that, but that's like the ultimate security, resulting again the lowest interest rate, and so on. And so that's the advantage of that. The rating agencies take that into account and net that out of your general debt if it's self-supported by an enterprise fund, utility system, or whatever. Then to the right of those are revenue bonds, and the city did at one point have a water and sewer revenue bond structure, but chose to just essentially collapse that and extinguish that because we had already started issuing certificates of obligation for all the water and sewer needs because of the economics associated and so on. And so ultimately that revenue structure was dissolved. Revenue bonds are going to be at a higher interest rate. There's more complexity and requirements imposed. You have to have excess coverage that you don't necessarily have if you're just self-supporting it out of, for instance, a certificate, as well as a reserve fund, a debt service reserve, and also just more costly and so on. Then tax notes are another tax-supported type of instruments that cities can use. And they have the same credit literally as a general obligation or a certificate of obligation, but they're limited to 7-year repayment. And so that's kind of the drawback. Unless it's a project that you can handle the repayment within that period of time, then you really couldn't use tax notes. Moving to the right, public property finance, contractual obligations. Used to, we did a lot of those for personal property uses and so on. It's really, I don't see those that much any longer, because strictly for personal property and equipment items and so on. And again, they're secured by taxes and so on. It's just the limited purpose that kind of is the drawback when, you could include whatever you're doing in a CO issue or whatever. A lot of cities have chosen just to do that instead of trying to issue. I will mention that lease purchase that I'll show you in a minute that you all did for water meters a few years ago was cited or done under that authority. It calls it a public property finance contractual obligation lease purchase and so on. And then the last that I've got there is contract revenue bonds, and that's a third party type structure like you have with the Colorado River Authority and so on, where they're undertaking financing typically not just for one entity, it can be, but kind of collectively for multiple members or participants or so on. So it's not something you do on your own, it's something that you're financing projects through another entity. One thing I failed to mention, and you'll see, I think in red on the page about COs, is if a city or county calls a bond election and it fails, then you're precluded from issuing certificates for 3 years thereafter. So the only alternative you'd really have in that case to consider undertaking the financing after a failed election is go back to the voters if you needed to do it anytime soon. And of course, you can do that, but the special elections, bond elections, can only be held twice a year on uniform dates in November and May. But you could conceivably go back to them the very next uniform date even, but you'd be forced to have to vote bonds, not pursue another means. I mentioned what the legislature had done, and if you'll turn to page 6, let me try to get there. In 2021, they really tightened and this applies not only to certificates of obligation, but tax notes and so on as well. What they did is tighten the purposes that they could be used for, and then that instrument or that debt issuance be considered debt, which would qualify for a INS tax rate being used. You can still issue certificates or whatever for other purposes that are allowed under the state law authorizing COs, but if they're not part of what's included in this House Bill 69, then you'd have to handle the debt service out of your M&O side. And of course, the legislature a few years ago really ratcheted down on that because you've only got the 3.5% limitation. And so most cities don't want to try to incorporate debt payments to any extent in their operating budget. So as you'll see, debt that's payable from a debt service tax can be approved in election, and then, as I said a while ago, self-supporting. So if you're issuing it for utilities or whatever, and they can fully support it, then you can use COs. And of course, you wouldn't be setting a tax rate anyway. Designated infrastructure, and this is really what's pertinent because it's the type of improvements within the city that you could use them for. And so, like I said, general purpose streets, parks, sidewalks. If you move up, renovating, improving existing buildings, utility systems, or public safety, all of those qualify under that designated infrastructure definition. As far as then, I want to go through just a bit about the process for issuing debt. And Kaylee mentioned Glenn and I. This is kind of who all is ultimately involved in a debt issuance where you're actually planning to go out to the public market. And you'll see the financial advisor, that's Hilltop in the city's case, and we get involved to help analyze, evaluate, model, and then ultimately prepare what's needed, working with bond counsel, Bracewell and Glenn's firm. They do all the legal and tax-related work on the front end and then through the process as well. And then the rest of those are not who city council necessarily deal with, but they're all parties that, you know, are part of what's required in the process and so on. And I will put one kind of caveat or change that if, for instance, you were doing water and sewer and going to the Texas Water Development Board, you still have to issue certificates or revenue bonds because that's what they buy from you, evidencing the debt. But it would eliminate several of those other parties because you wouldn't be going out to the public market, but still the advisor and bond counsel would be working to construct an issue to actually sell and deliver to them. I included some information here about credit ratings. The city has had very good credit ratings. Right now, we still have a AA with Fitch. They have left that intact based on expectation, you know, that they will see 23 audit soon, and so we're having to kind of talk with them. However, both Moody's and Standard & Poor have withdrawn their ratings. Moody's had AA2, again, comparable to the Fitch rating. S&P's was lower. To me, that's not indicative of the credit of the city, and that's why we haven't used them since 2019. They adopted new policies back at that point in time with respect to pensions that cities or other entities had, and so that was the result of this downgrade. I've got 3 other cities that we no longer go to S&P either because they have standalone pension plans too, and it's just kind of a punitive type of evaluation. And also, as far as active ratings, we've used Fitch and Moody's on the most recent issues.
What was the rating with Standard & Poor's?
With Standard & Poor's A+.
Okay.
Not a bad rating, but still, it's consistent when the other two have you at the mid-AA level, and so anything that deviates that much, it's an inconsistency, and I didn't find it acceptable. And they know I don't like how they rate cities that have pension funds and so on. And then the last page in the book is really just, and it's more appropriate to have it circular. But this is kind of start to finish what the financing process consists of. And the reason I mentioned circular is because even after debt's issued, we get a lot of calls. There's still things that have to be done, monitor for potential refinancing or refundings, and then probably be working on a new issue. So it's kind of an ongoing involvement in that case. I also put together this information with respect to the city itself, and again, I'll try to get through it quickly. This is what the city has outstanding at the time, this point in time, and all of them are certificates of obligation, or if you'll see general obligation refunding bonds, that's just what they have to be deemed. But I think all 3 of those first 3 issues have actually refinanced outstanding certificates because the city hadn't gone to the voters in quite some time. The only thing that's not included, or that's included differently, like I said, is the lease purchase that was done in 2023 to purchase water meters. And you'll notice the asterisks, the 2015 issue, part of it, and then all of the 2021, which of course was water treatment plant, are self-supported by water and sewer revenues. This is the city's debt service. This does not include the lease payments on the water meter lease, but you can see totaling around 20 million, 21 million as it stands, and then some slight drops. The second from the right column is the water and sewer supported portion, and then over on the right-hand side is the general purpose debt. And right now, your total principal after payments this year is around 202 million, because the 13.6 that was paid off in 2024. And if I'm not mistaken, the general purpose portion of that is only about 120, I think. I'd have to pull that out, and Kaylee may have it handy. This is the debt service, and in this case, we added the lease payments, which are about $3.5 million a year. So they just increased the total and the water and sewer supported portion for a 20-year period out through 2044. But again, you can see on the general purpose side, after 2027, you've got about a $700,000 drop, but otherwise it's pretty static, and then it drops off again 2035 or 2034 significantly, and that's where you can always look and identify, well, here's where we have capacity, or if we could structure that where it would minimize, hopefully, impact and capacity exists. I also put some information. This is a taxable value of the city. You've grown over the last 3 years a little bit over 4% per year, which is very healthy, and that's important because here I was trying to evaluate what the capacity might be under a couple of different rating criteria, debt as a percent of that value, and then debt per capita, and so on. And actually, you're already at that $12 million taxable value level. And going to the right is if we just maintain the ratio we have now, which is probably a little overly strong, you know, what would the capacity be? And then what would the rating impact be if we kind of distorted or issued up? And you can see if the debt to AV gets to about 1.2, you might start, you know, the rating agencies evaluating it a little stronger, pressured if it got up to around 1.5%. And then on debt per capita, you're good again. And I went through these and tried to kind of come to some reasonable average. And I think overall, if everything was in place to be able to approach the rating agencies, that, you know, somewhere 50 to 80 million or so on would be justifiable if that was acceptable to council, taxpayers, and so on. This is the debt service associated with just various size of issuances, and we had run this back a few years ago for the city, so I kind of maintained the same ultimate 250 million or so, and those rates are pretty close to what they are right now. Like I said, interest rates have gone up over the last few weeks based on inflation not really tailing off, and then kind of concern about the new administration, what that'll do, but we're at about those levels. And then one thing I included was the $1 million of annual debt service. And just to let you know, at those rates I just showed you, $1 million would support about a $13 million issue on 20-year repayment, or about a $16 million issue if it was stretched out 30 years, which is really not normal for Odessa and entities like you, because the desire is to be more conservative and shorten. So you get to West Texas, and really most of my issuers, 20 years is more the norm. So every $1 million that the rates I showed, the 4 1/4 support about $13 million of debt issuance. And you can see at the $12 billion taxable value that you are at now, that would be about 0.86 cent tax impact to support that $1 million payment. I ran it today, a penny, every penny would support about $1.164 million of annual debt service. So if you're looking or thinking about projects and wanting to play with math, and then we can get anything like that that might help you. And then this is reflective of the water and sewer system, its ability to support debt. And I basically concluded, you know, the water and sewer system does have capacity to support financing of its needs. The only problem is there's an inconsistency between 2022 and what we have for 2023. Again, that's not yet audited numbers as far as the overall net revenues and net revenues available for debt service. And you can see at that very bottom, when you net out the debt service you have now on the self-supported as well as the lease payments, the variation is $6 million a year or $19 million a year. And that's just too big a spread. But even at the $6 million, you know, that would support easily somewhere upwards of nearly $100 million of financing if the case was such. But that hopefully it's not too quick, but a reasonable walkthrough of the city's debt position. And we'd be glad to answer any questions, myself, Glenn, whatever.
George, one quick question. Didn't we have some debt fall off, have some coming off this year, or is it 26?
It's 26,
20.
according to that sheet.
Because I know we structured those last COs for interest only until that debt fell off.
you've got, if you'll look at this, the 14, and of course, there's not much balance left there, retires March 1st to 26, and then 27 is the 15 when it fully goes away. And that was supported by the Water and Sewer Fund, and that's why we wrapped it somewhat with the 21 till we got to that 27 payments, where for the first 3 or 4 years, debt service didn't have to be any higher than it did.
Right.
And you can kind of see that there, that as of 2027, the water and sewer debt service falls off by about 1.7 million a year.
Yeah. Just remember that, okay. Just want to make sure I was correct.
So, I'm kind of a big picture kind of guy, George, so how would you grade our financial position? A, B, C, D, E, or F?
I think the city is good. I mean, I don't want to give an A to F type grade, but the rating agencies, that's what they do. They give you grades. So if you're in the AA category, then you are a very, highly rated city. And that's what Odessa is. And also, you haven't been that active in debt issuance. So, as Mr. Thompson said, you have stuff actually, paying off, so your debt balance is going down and you haven't been driving it up. I'll give you an example. You've got 220 million or 202 million all total, not counting the lease, outstanding right now. I was in Midland. They've got over 540 million. So, you're less than half debt burden relative to some of, what you'd maybe consider peer cities and so on.
And I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but assuming we got all of our audits caught up, what's the lead time between getting back on a bond rating for Standard & Poor's and Moody?
Well, if we knew the audit was going to be released, we'd try to be proactive and say, we'll have the audit in hand. We would like to schedule a rating meeting if that was what the city wanted to do, and not wait for them to get it and then request. But we could actually kind of try to get the process rolling as soon as we knew financials were going to be available.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Does that rating happen fairly quickly? Once you go to them?
Once we got everything to them and had the discussions and this and that, a month would be hopefully outside.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
George, I did have a question.
Yes,
Just looking at some of the popular bonds that are used for the city in the state of Texas, the Municipal Utility Districts Bond, the MUD, is that something in a tool chest that the city could ever look at? Or?
Well, the city itself doesn't do that, and Glenn probably is more of a mud expert than I am. They're actually a municipal utility district is a separate political entity. And of course, what's being used probably more prevalently now, and those are really for development purposes to finance public infrastructure associated, or public improvement districts and so on, because they're assessment based. The MUD, like I said, it's separate and it has its own tax power, and so sometimes cities kind of regret, I guess you'd say, having a MUD overlay or whatever, because it's your taxes, theirs, and those citizens are different than the others or whatever, I guess. So
George?
Yes, sir.
Would you go back to page 5 on the debt capacity? I'd just like a good understanding of what our possible debt capacity. Yes, sir.
Okay.
So if I'm reading that right, either by population or tax base, on the tax base side, you're saying the additional capacity would be 73 million at 12
somewhere
billion?
between, that middle column would kind of be ideal, because I don't think that, like I said, moved the needle with the rating agencies. Once we started moving up to like the debt as a percentage of taxable value of 1.5% or more, then there might be some pressure. So the 73 yeah, we would probably be good at today's taxable value up to around there.
Is that the total amount of debt to be issued or the debt service?
That's new, if you'll look up at the very top, and that, yeah, that, I thought I remembered that correctly. 106 million is your current general tax-supported debt. So that italics 73,045, that's above the 106. So that 180 million is the total debt capacity at that point, but that would have to take into account what you have outstanding.
Okay, so if we need to build fire stations or those type of things, that would come out of that debt capacity.
Yes, sir, because they're not supported by separate revenues like
Gotcha.
water and sewer purposes.
So that's based on the taxable value, right?
That one's based on the taxable value.
Yes, sir.
Right, at 12 billion, yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir. I should have just dropped those lower ones off of this and maybe extrapolated a little further, but 12 billion is where you are roughly right now, that page that I showed you.
So Richard, what does it cost us to build a fire station, for instance?
Jason, you remember the last one we built?
I don't know exactly how much, but depending on which one, I believe the cheaper end was about 10 million.
Okay.
10 million? Is that 9? 9? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Station 9 out of 87? Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? George, thank you very much for coming up there. We really appreciate the information and showing us a little bit more.
Questions from a legal perspective?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
I didn't know if you wanted to ask any questions pertaining to the sports complex or any concerns there. It's up to you.
I was gonna, well, we should let both speak first, or we just?
Sure. Glenn, were you planning on speaking separately or?
Not unless you had questions on anything in
Okay.
particular.
Yeah.
Can we bring both of you up for a few questions? We're gonna try to put some,
We can bring up the twins.
The only thing you have in common is bald heads, and then there's a lot of those up here.
yeah, a lot of good-looking heads out there is all I can say. Gentlemen, we are in the process of looking at building a sports complex, the Amy Bell Sports Complex, and I think you've recently become, I know you've been aware of it, but, we've been having meetings on a bi-weekly basis. And we're just trying to get our heads around what the city can do, which is, so I know you're familiar with it. I know that there's been some changes, but we're trying to figure out if it's viable for the city from the 30,000-foot view, if you will, right? And just so we're all clear on the facts, the total obligation was around $80 million to build the sports center. And then there's going to be obviously revenue generated and expenses generated, and hopefully we're going to be comfortable that can break even and perhaps be a revenue generator. Maybe not. That's up for the council. They'll have to hear those pro forma numbers, but we're trying to wrap our head around whether or not it's a viable position for the city to move forward on that. If that's a fair question?
Yeah, a fair question. Let me say, from the legal perspective, when you say, is it a viable opportunity? I mean, from my perspective on the legal side, I mean, there's a lot left to be done. The structure is rather complicated.
Yes, sir.
Right? It involves a ground lease to another entity who would then go out and issue presumably tax-exempt bonds and then sublease and then lease that back to the city, and then there's another sublease. I mean, a lot of work to be done on how those things might be structured. As I understood it from, though there have been some changes that I'm not sure I'm fully up to date on, that structure, that lease payment by the city would be a subject to appropriation lease payment, which would mean it would be on the O&M side, right? From the city's perspective, I guess it would be offset by whatever revenues in the sublease to the foundation that you got. But from that perspective, I mean, as a legal construct, it's rather complicated but doable, I guess is what I would say. I think you need I think you need counsel at every step of that way. I mean, we've done a lot of these development agreements. They get kind of sticky, and you need to be able to make sure that you are putting a box as well as you can around your obligations, and that you're maintaining them as subject to appropriation obligations, and it doesn't veer off into trying to get other revenue streams of the city pledged into that payment. But from the legal perspective, is it doable? Is it more complicated than doing a certificate of obligation? Quite a bit more complicated. More costly from the legal perspective to do that than to do a CO? Quite extensively, multiple factors. But George, from a revenue perspective, it is a very different credit than any other credit that you have. But it is a subject to appropriation obligation, which in theory says you could terminate it. But essentially, whatever that lease term is, you're committing to those payments over that period of time. So in that sense, the bond market's going to expect you to pay that lease payment. Right.
So it's the city's obligation.
Yeah, it may be subject to appropriation, but in the past, in the rate, George can speak to this, I know when entities have non-appropriated, they've taken a rating hit for it, because it's not just about your ability to pay, it's about your willingness to pay. It is a long-term commitment that you would, even though you do have that ability, I think you would need to view it as a long-term commitment over that horizon.
What Glenn said, rating agencies have this term selective default that they use, and they see that if a city enters into something, even if it's not rated by them, but it constituted even subject to annual appropriation obligation, if you fail to appropriate, they'll take rather punitive. I mean, the ones that have occurred, they've actually reduced the rating to below investment grade for the city itself, because they just see that as an indication of non-willingness to pay, non-financial management. Just thinking, if you came and said what would be the most economical way to finance sports fields and so on, well, that would typically be as part of your park system using certificates of obligation. You could do that tax exempt and so on. And even if you were engaging someone to manage the fields outside, if you had the right type of qualified management agreement, tax exemptions stay intact and this and that, like Glenn said, then moving to where it's a lease back type deal and subject to appropriation. And I've seen they're saying this will not be rated, so it won't have a credit rating, and it's going to carry a much higher interest rate than anything literally the city could do on its own.
So with the current situation with our audit and lack of bond rating, could we issue certificates of obligation to build it?
The only way right now, without having the audits in hand, would be if there was a financial institution that would consider doing a direct placement where you could legally authorize COs issue, but would something like that be, and not necessarily long term, but with the intent of them, holding and those maturing or being redeemed once you could refinance, something like that. So there might be that possibility. I do have even a question about the speed of what's being proposed on the sports complex, because if the city's the ultimate obligor, your lease obligation, then any offering documents associated with whatever they're planning to issue would need to show current financials of the city, which you don't have those in that case either. And so I don't know that they could market those bonds without the audits.
That is something I've been exploring, because I've had some people come to me, but and they said to think about it like an interim bridge loan, if you will. But that's doable. We have a bank that is interested in doing that. We haven't pursued it because we were still trying to figure out this other situation.
That would be really the only financing source absent audited financials.
In your opinion, would that be a bad direction to go? Or
no, sir. If there was a lender that would consider that and wouldn't require the audits. You know, their examiners and regulators, you know, they could carry that they'd buy COs, book it as a municipal loan in their portfolio and so on, and no, that wouldn't be bad.
And George, I guess you would make those, to do that, when you're talking about it as a bridge, you would put some, obviously to have their maturity, but you would try to put some kind of a shorter call.
Yes.
What we call it, shorter call on it, that would give you the option to refund it and refinance it when you get your, you know, on a short, maybe a short
Well,
throw,
when
a
we get
year
our-
or two.
when we
or
get our rating-
When you get your ratings and you get back in order.
That's what
Yeah.
we've been talking about,
Yeah,
so
Exactly.
that might be an alternative.
So is the common denominator stumbling block that I'm hearing here is our audit keeping us from advancing forward?
And again, bear with me, because I'm new to the job, but like revenue bonds wouldn't work in this particular situation. I'm looking at your alternatives. I'm trying to figure out any other way to get it done that would float.
That's still the city's credit, it's just you're securing those bonds by specific revenue source. But again, you have to have financials and everything else that you do, whether you're doing a tax back or not. So yes, sir, the audit's really critical to move forward, unless there was some bridge possibility.
We appreciate that. Guys, any other questions or thoughts?
I just, while you're here though, so what comes to mind is Dad's old principle of KISS. Keep it simple, and this is pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Would it be worth looking into something that would satisfy the KISS principle?
Do it.
That'd be up to the council.
Well, if it were kept simple, it would be less expensive, is the way I'm looking at it.
Right.
Ultimately, for the ratepayers.
Right.
So one of the things, George, that I was thinking about, because I have had a bank approach me about doing a bridge, but in that regard, Mr. Morton will love this, we could pledge ODC funds as collateral for that bridge loan. And that's where I was coming from before on the revenue bonds for ODC, I was thinking for infrastructure, for roads and so forth, to start with. And then I got to thinking about, we've got $80 million sitting there, and that's about what the project. So if we could put half of that up as as security for a $80 million bridge loan, is that something that might be doable?
I think it'd be a matter of, could the ODC under, I don't know. If
It's a 4A corporation.
IB,
It's a 4A.
It's a
Yeah,
4A.
we may not be able to pledge that from on COs particularly. The AG's had some issues with that. But what you do is you issue your COs and you have that arrangement in place from your perspective to, it lowers your exposure to it. And you use it like you do in a way, like we do with your certificates of obligation for your utility side. There's a limited pledge on your COs of utility revenue. It's only $1,000, and that's only there to check a box in the statute to be able to sell for cash. But you consider it self-supporting from that perspective. You use utility revenues to offset the need to do the tax pledge. And so I think that's more the way we would be looking at that, unless you wanted to try to do something separate with the ODC as a development as bond issue.
That's why I brought up that I don't know that a 4A can finance sports fields.
Yeah, that's
under
true.
their-
That was my
They
concern.
can old ones that not do
Yeah,
that,
but
which doesn't
we've
make any
done
sense to me. But
just a small example, Andrews, that's why they did their feeder route. They've got a sales tax contract with their Economic Development Corp that flows the sales tax money to the city for the debt service on that and so on. But the COs, I mean, there wouldn't necessarily be a need to do that unless you needed the cash flow for some period or whatever. But as far as the security,
Yeah.
the COs with the city's ad valorem tax behind it is the best security. So if a bank's willing to consider it, that would be most interest.
Yeah.
Like we'll sell you COs, you're fully secured.
And to George's point, the ODC flow would be more about you managing your actual payment on the debt, and getting that buy-in and that participation from another source versus the security for the debt.
But there's a way to do that. I mean, you're saying it might be a doable deal.
Yeah, we'll figure that out.
If they had revenues that yesterday were wanting to flow and willing to flow to the city to help
I
offset.
don't think so, but I can ask. So the question is, rather than issuing the debt, I think, could ODC fund $80 million worth of construction of a sports complex? So you are spending, in this scenario, spending $4A on a 4B project.
If we took it to a vote.
Yeah, we're gonna get there.
I mean, are there mechanisms within state law to spend $4A on 4B projects? That's the better question.
That would be up to the attorneys.
Yeah. Oh,
I'd
yeah.
have to look at that.
No.
Yeah.
I don't know of any. I mean, we always have the option of going to a vote to actually create a 4B along with a 4A for ODC. That would need to be voted on as well, but just sitting here off the top of my head, I can't think of any.
Does the city, I mean, sorry, do people have to vote to go with the
To a 4B.
4B? Okay.
Or to do a new, sports, venue under local government 334, I think is what it is, to get the, you'd also have to do that for the additional 2%. That would need a vote on it, but yeah.
You have to vote the venue tax and the venue bonds
You're
and
gonna-
projects.
yeah, Exactly. You're gonna have to vote eventually.
Do you know if you have to put, if you go to the vote for transitioning to 4B or a portion to 4B, do you have to put at risk the ability to continue to do the 4A?
Off the top of my head, I cannot give you a clear answer sitting here.
Okay.
And I would be committing my practice to try to do so.
Okay.
I mean, what I can tell you is that if we were gonna go to a 4B, we would need to vote on it. Ector County would need to come, and they would need to vote, okay, the ODC now can fund a 4B as well as a 4A.
I know, I understand that, but there's something in the back of my head that says if you do that, you could risk losing, if the voters say no to that.
Risk losing the 4A?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're correct on that.
Okay.
I think you're correct.
Can you check into it?
Yeah, we're happy to work with you on looking at that question if you want us to.
Please.
Get with our economic development experts that, deal with that every day. Yeah.
Because we don't want to go vote for one and then lose the other. And then
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
We don't want that.
No.
And we can definitely kind of investigate that with you.
Well, it sounds like we need to pull you in and get you the latest documentation, for lack of a better word. They've got it.
They have it.
Okay, perfect.
They do, okay.
And I agree, if we continue moving on with the team that we have, they need to be at the table.
They do,
Okay.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Agree.
They do, they need to be there.
And if we don't move forward with that team, they need to be at the
They're gonna have to be involved.
Richard's absolutely right. These two gentlemen need to be at every step on that sports complex.
Gentlemen, we do appreciate your time. Any other questions or discussion? Thank you all very much for coming out. We really appreciate
Appreciate
it.
the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to item number 4. We may need to table that, but can I get you to come up here? Kaylee, this is to review of financial impact of preliminary compensation study figures.
Hello again. It is the Kaylee Bonda Show today, and of course the George and Glenn Show. Thank you guys again. Take care. Okay, so we briefly went over some very high-level numbers at the council retreat on Saturday, and we were going to go into detail today. Whenever I pulled the data to prepare for today, I realized that one very big change that will be happening today was not factored in at the time of the initial data pool. The vacancies were not factored into the Gallagher numbers initially. So we've already spoken with Gallagher, and we're going to be getting them the information that they need to incorporate that data, but we didn't want to present something to you that was incomplete. What good is that for decision making? So we're working on pulling that data for them so that they can better polish their numbers for us, and we'll come back to you to present the financial impact
Thank you. I'd rather wait till we have the final report, not
Yes.
confuse anyone with numbers that aren't going to be righteous, so.
Yes.
Let's, do I need a motion to table that?
I so move.
So moved by Mr. Vasquez, second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously. We'll table that motion. And with that, we can adjourn if I can have a motion.
So moved.
Moved by Councilman Stoker. There's second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you everyone for coming today. We really appreciate it.